Coin traders, how we doing? Thanks for joining me for the show, looking at Hedera HBAR, HBAR on that ticker. Yesterday was just an absolutely insane candle. We were looking at basically a 50% gain. And if we go ahead and look at this candle some more, go ahead and zoom in on the one that just closed. Not much of an upside wick here. So a lot of just continuous upside buy pressure. And especially on this candle, you can see not much of a downside shadow here as well. Very, very, very minimal. So a very nice looking bullish candle here. And in fact, if we actually look at the most recent bullish candles, they're extremely nice looking without much selling pressure coming in at the tops. So even if we look at some of the sell pressure, we can just see not that much sell pressure that has been sustaining. And even then, we do see that it's pretty much just the bulls taking a break because we don't have a lot of pull from the bears to actually see prices get pushed a little bit farther. So for example, in this instance, 2 full days worth for pretty much only about 15%. So each candle here was looking about 7 to 8%. So we're actually looking at not that much downside continuous action. And especially when we see very nice bullish candles like we've seen, we know that a lot of the power and the direction here is in favor of extreme bullish upside momentum. Now, typically when we see big explosive days like the candle we just saw, it's not necessarily that sustainable past a few days. So we already had one very nice bullish candle off of this little tiny pullback. Didn't even have a full test yet of a kickoff of this 12-period EMA on this daily chart here. So pretty much ever since the middle of November, where we actually did just absolutely kick off and take off, we haven't seen on this daily chart a pullback and a retracement to test this 12-period EMA. And we know that it's pretty much just inevitable at this point. But anyway, going back to the amount of consecutive days. So we had several nice bullish days here working on the next one to the upside. But like mentioned, we know that typically only a few days worth on this type of big action before anything significant and huge happens. So for example, if we do actually want to look at a little bit of a trend line here that was kind of rising in this instance, looking at a very nice trend line to the upside that we did break above. So from the current prices, a pullback to that level would be about a 44% pullback, right? So it definitely seems extreme, but if we actually look at how far above these exponential moving averages we are, as well as this trend line, we know that that's definitely not unreasonable, especially looking back before, right as the election happened, looking at the Trump pump here happening, and we are from that point up almost 750%, so about an 8.5x gain on that. And then from obviously the bottom up to the top of the daily candle right now, coming in just shy of 40 cents, over 825%, so almost 830, so about 9.3x return from the top. Obviously a little bit less in that instance. So we know that huge upside gains without a lot of selling pressure to the downside. So big potential and potential risk for a massive sell-off here. And especially when we have a lot of these driven pumps, obviously being fueled by a lot of the speculation, since we're looking at some of the HBAR members potentially in consideration for the SEC to replace Gary Gensler here. So a lot of great news, great hype. And obviously, as you can see just in this instance, how bullish things can actually get for crypto. And like we've always talked about on the channel, things can always get more bullish than we ever imagined. I don't think necessarily anyone was expecting this much of a nice bullish pump and this much gains in just about a month's time period here. Now, I do want to flip into the daily chart here and just talk about potential signals and signs that we're going to be looking for a top, because we know that on the daily, we're not going to see a top out until we actually change the trend on some of the shorter charts first. So right now in this very nice parabolic stage here, looking like a potential for a top, but we actually need to see this trend change on the hourly first. And especially after the last couple of times, hadn't even seen full tests of this 12-period EMA on this period. We know that that's just a huge sign for complete vertical move. And we know that that does need to change. And obviously it will correct and retrace, pretty much just a matter of when. So as long as we do see bulls either consolidating or maintaining an uptrend in that instance, we're not going to see a top coming in just yet for HBAR, despite maybe potential for a day or two of a little bit more of that consolidation and a little bit more of that retracement. But like we said, as long as this doesn't change a trend on this 1 hour chart, we're still going to be in power of the bulls to see path of least resistance very much to the upside before we actually look for a little bit more of that longer term consolidation and pullback. We actually go ahead and pull up some technicals and we talk about bearish divergence here, and we look at several peaks coming in that are actually getting shorter, but they're not that significant. So if we actually see, usually, for example, this one was high and then this one started to taper off and then the follow-on ones were barely breaking, that would be a lot more significant. But because all of these are pretty significant and have a lot of magnitude pretty much right around the 80 line, it does show a lot of strength in this upside move, but still, nonetheless, we have to know that there is that potential. But as long as we are still setting higher lows on this RSI, as we do see the peaks getting higher or staying the same, that's pretty much going to be a sign that we're looking at. But like we mentioned, still going to have a potential, especially as this exponential moving average does get to the upside as well. It does start to increase the likelihood that this RSI is actually not going to be able to maintain the RSI and the trend on top of that exponential moving average. So with that said, do want to look at the daily chart, and like we talked about, we can't necessarily call a top or a slowdown in momentum just yet until we actually do lose the trend on the shorter time charts. And also want to pull up the volume here, because as long as we do have increased and great, nice bullish volume coming in, that's going to just absolutely continue this trend. And so if we go ahead too and look at the bear volume that's come in on any of these sell-offs, we do see bear volume has been weakening as well. So an actual decline in bear volume over these periods when we've actually seen the potential for consolidation that leads to a sell-off. So none of that selling's really been coming in, and the bulls have been defending very nicely, and then also having a lot of these extremely nice volume spikes and pumps that pretty much does lead to a lot of strength. But we know that with a climax typically does lead to a little bit more of a pullback and a consolidation effort. Just whether or not it will ultimately end up being kind of like what we saw before, where we don't necessarily see a pullback with consolidation. We more or less just see kind of sideways trading with a slow, steady uptrend here. And that's why we do have that overall trend line that we did just break out through. So if we are looking for a potential downside target and move, we're going to have a very big, nice zone here, pretty much coming in just shy of the 30-cent mark. So from current prices, about 35 cents, we would be looking at a potential pullback to that level. And that would actually be a pretty nice level to pull back to, because from current prices, it would be about a 15% retracement, which seems like a lot, but especially given about 700+% gains, we know that that's going to be the next level that was previous resistance on that trend. Allow these exponential moving averages to kick up, confirm support, and then hopefully in that instance, put in that higher low before we actually see the potential for a trend reversal. But if we look at how much magnitude would be retracing, the longer we do see a pullback, the harder it is to put in the next upside higher high. So typically we do end up looking for and being potentially aware of a lower high to come in and potentially a new lower low. If that does happen, then that will be a trend change on the shorter term charts. And that's where we're going to start to look for some downside targets, knowing that a potential top has been coming in for the longer term, specifically the daily and longer charts. So with these 1 hour charts too, we've actually already seen our peak amount of 1 hour volume come in, and that wasn't the highest high for the price. So we were actually looking at that happening and then still setting the next higher high on the shorter term trend. So pulling back now to about the price levels that we were looking at on that big volume spike. So that's exactly the point that we want to see whether or not volume is going to sustain and whether or not we can actually see bulls defend some of these lower supports by that dip as we do retrace on these exponential moving averages and allow the price to likely and hopefully consolidate into more of a pennant type formation, or ultimately buying those lows and continuing on the next leg of this big vertical move. Not necessarily sustainable for that long. And as a matter of fact, I actually did make a tweet about this earlier today, talking about how there will be a sizable correction for a lot of these altcoins that have just absolutely been exploding and rocketing to the upside, because none of these movements are sustainable. So again, this isn't me necessarily calling a top, because we will be needing to look at the shorter term trends for that. But right now, we know that a lot of these big upside moves are ultimately going to lead to big and significant retracements here on a lot of these charts. It always happens. It's just a function of how financial markets work, and especially the crypto spaces, which are obviously a lot of hype sentiment and speculation driven here. And historically, we've seen it time and time again, and we don't have one single chart example of a crypto just absolutely going parabolic and seeing these type of gains in this short of a time without any sort of massive sell-off and retracement that follows. So yeah, if you're not currently following me here over on Twitter or X, at coin_trades is the handle. Looking forward to chatting with everyone over on X. But so do want to drop into the weekly chart now and specifically just zoom out and talk about how this actually compares to where we were back in the last bull cycle. So as you can see, when we actually had our first very nice growth, that actually took a little bit longer, but we also had this big, nice explosive growth. Obviously following there, we did see a pretty long retracement that pulled back, let's see, from the point of the highest close down to the low, about 54% before rallying up to about 165%, putting that next leg in upside target. And pretty much right now, we are at that stage now. So very good likelihood this cycle of seeing another new all-time high for HBAR, but whether or not it does happen in the near-term future or how much it actually performs and pumps during the longer-term nice bull cycle and alt season, we don't know just yet. But with any crypto and investment, we know that the higher you do make your entries, the higher the risk is for this potential flush, which would lead to pretty big gains. So definitely a lot more risky and a lot higher to make new entries in this overall level, kind of in the current setup. Obviously, if you did make entries later, you're sitting very nice gains, might be potential and time to start taking some profits here. Not financial advice, of course, but anyway, definitely a lot more risky with this kind of a setup on this kind of chart. Because like we said, historically, we know that any big vertical moves like this always lead to a pretty significant sell-off and retracement, whether or not that happens soon, immediately, or whatnot, or if it is prolonged over a course of a few months, kind of like what we've seen before, is up for anyone's best guess. Don't necessarily see an immediate quick flush and sell-off, but yeah, typically in the crypto space, we know that these big moves to the upside always usually have a pretty significant tail that retraces almost just as much. But the good news is that because we have rallied so much in such a short amount of time, we do have plenty of downside supports to hopefully fall on, because when we do have just big vertical moves and we don't spend time setting up and establishing resistive points, that doesn't really give as much to fall back onto when we do talk about some of those supportive downside targets. So that is kind of where we do look at historical levels here, where we were looking at before. Even potentially looking at a nice rising trend line could be a very nice opportunity for the price to find some support on that, since we didn't really have a lot of trading historically here for a lot of those levels. And so speaking of, do want to turn on VPVR, volume profile, visible range. Just want to point out the fact that on this weekly chart for HBAR, did have a big pullback, obviously right off the elections, the big point of the most speculation about where we were finding a bottom here right around the 5 cent mark and having a very nice opportunity to bounce off this big center point of mass. So do want to look at the RSI for this weekly chart as well. The current week, we're almost at the 90 line, about 89.69. Still got just shy of 6 days left, so anything can happen. But just know that when we do get this far extended on these type of charts, it does increase the likelihood of a little bit more of that pullback. So we know that this still can go higher. The price still can go higher as well. But ultimately, we do need to see, just like in every instance previously, that this RSI does ultimately end up correcting back below the 70 line here and being back to a little bit more normal levels. So with that, that pretty much does correlate to a potential that ultimately we're going to see this price retrace at some point. Like we said, the higher it does go up, the higher that support will be found. And obviously, we would love to be coming in and breaking pretty much right around the all-time high for closing resistance. Closing resistance all-time high right now, just shy of 45 cents, 44.19. So that is going to be one of our shorter-term targets. So if we can actually see a price rally to that point, we're only pretty much looking at about 25% from the current prices, and from the current trend high right now, only looking at about 10, just over 10 to 12. So definitely exciting and fun, wild times here in HBAR land, and definitely congrats to all the bulls holding HBAR right now. Hope you're enjoying all these nice gains, and definitely make sure you have a plan for profit taking and all of that, because as we do see the chart going more and more vertical like it has been going, obviously, like we said, just to reiterate, the increased likelihood for a risk and pullback does start to greatly increase. So not necessarily the best time to be making a lot of new entries. And because a lot more people do start thinking that, that does start to slow down the upside growth. And that's kind of when we do get our initial sell-off. So Anyway, not financial advice as always, and that will go ahead and wrap up the show for today on Hedera HBAR, HBAR. If you did enjoy the show today, I would appreciate you hitting that thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. And make sure to leave me a note, questions, comments, issues, disagreements, all that stuff down in the comments sections or over on X at @coin_trades. Do look forward to getting back to each and every one of you, either in the comments or over on X. But with that, that is going to wrap it up. So stay safe, take care, coin traders, and I will catch you back in the next video.